across a bunch of different time zones. So I'd like to get started to have as much time as possible with our special guests. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this conversation on Indigenous futures and climate change. My name is Morgane. I am a recent graduate of a master's in anthropology at Simon Fraser University, and I will be mediating this conversation. This event today was prompted by a mentor and friend of ours, the co-director of the Simon Fraser University David Lamb Center, and a great connector of people, Dr. Michael Hathaway, who wanted to bring together these brilliant young people in various career stages across various geographies, from so-called Canada and the United States to Nepal and Tibet, to have a public conversation on this topic. Thank you to our panelists for being here early in the morning and late in the evening. It's wonderful to have you here joining us from Nepal, Boston, and Vancouver, BC. I'd also like to thank the David Lamb Center for their generous support of today's event. Thank you especially to Doris and Joelle, whose brilliance and hard work make this and so many events possible. It is a joy to work with them. Thank you as well to Pasang Sherpa for your support and Michael Hathaway for prompting this event. As we open today's conversation, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the technological hosts of this webinar are located on the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Unceded means that this land was never relinquished or handed over in any way, and as such remains under the legal and moral right of these nations to govern. Land back. As such, I would like to offer a couple of calls to action that I will link in the chat momentarily, including native-land.ca, a tool to locate whose lands you are on, a link to pay your rent if you are a settler on so-called Canadian land. There's a donation link to First Nations across Canada, and a link to the article by Dr. Dawa Lokitsang that we will be discussing today. So we'll begin by introducing our fabulous speakers. First, we have Sharana Sherpa. Sharana Sherpa is a communication associate at the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development from Nepal. She has also actively participated in the International Indigenous Forum on Climate Change. Sharana is pursuing a BA in English Literature at Tribhuvan University and recently attended COP29 in Azerbaijan. Sharana is an advocate and organizer for global Indigenous rights and solutions to climate change. Sharana, would you like to add anything?
Hello, thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you, everyone. I think that was great. I'll add more in during my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. Next, we have Dr. Dawa T. Lokitsang, who is a Tibetan American political and historical anthropologist. Her scholarship looks at Tibetan agency as an anti-colonial effort in response to China's developing imperial colonialism in Tibet. Her scholarship on Tibetan schools in India historicizes the national agency of Tibetans in exile and examines how the preservation of their national and spiritual identity as Tibetans, an identity criminalized and securitized by China within Tibet itself, became grounds for community building and movement-generating efforts that regularly unsettled China's settler colonial consumption of Tibet. Her scholarship on the decolonizing agency of Tibetans thus sits at the intersection of developing Asian imperial colonialisms, reactive anti-colonial nationalisms, and creative indigenous sovereign futurism. Dr. Lokitsang, would you like to say any words?
Thank you for that brief introduction. I just want to acknowledge that I'm actually in Massachusetts, and we're on the original land of Massachusetts people. And also to acknowledge that the settler colonial invasion of North American territories began in Boston with the founding of the settler stakes. We have the that's commemorated every year. which in many ways is the beginning of the whole system.
Thank you so much. And lastly, we have Evan Asatola, who is a proud Métis citizen with deep roots in the Georgian Bay Métis community. As a licensed practical nurse, Evan brings a unique perspective based on his healthcare experience to discussions surrounding climate change, focusing on the intersection of environmental and human health. Evan is a passionate advocate for Indigenous rights and knowledges and serves as the president of the Métis Nation of Ontario Youth Council. His academic background in sociology, criminology, and Indigenous studies also work to inform his understanding of the profound social and cultural impacts of climate change. Evan attended COP28 and the Student Energy Summit in Dubai and Abu Dhabi last year, which further strengthened his commitment to climate action. With his diverse experiences and dedication, Evan is a powerful voice for climate justice and Indigenous-led solutions. Evan, would you like to add anything?
I'm gonna do it a second time. I'm in SFU right now, so I am just gonna acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the traditional Coast Salish, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations.
Thank you so much. So the flow of today's event will have a presentation from Sharana on loss and damage in the Indigenous peoples of Nepal. I'll then give a brief introduction and an overview of Dr. Lokitsang's article that we've all read, and it's okay if you have not read it yet. I will link it very shortly in the chat for you all to have a chance to read afterwards. It's a beautiful and important article. So that will be there for you afterwards, and we'll make sure that it's clear what we're talking about without having read it yet. And then we will get into our discussion, some prompts based on some excerpts from the article, and have a nice discussion, and then we will hopefully get into a Q&A at the end. Some closing remarks, and we'll call it a day. So to begin, I'd like to invite Sharana to begin your presentation.
Thank you, Morgan. I'll just share my slides. Okay, I hope you all can see my slides. Okay, so Tashi Delek, everyone. As Morgan has already introduced me, I am Sharana Sherpa, and I belong to the Sherpa Indigenous community, and I'm currently in Kathmandu, which is actually the land of Newa Indigenous communities, while my homeland is in Solukhumbu. So today, in the beginning, I'm going to give a short, brief presentation and a case of Indigenous communities in Udaipur, Nepal, and how Indigenous communities there have been dealing with the loss and damage due to climate change, but not only due to climate change, but also due to the development works as well as the modern education. Okay. So before starting, okay. So before starting, I would like to first give a brief background of Indigenous peoples in Nepal. The Constitution of Nepal of 2015 has formally defined Indigenous peoples and also has established the National Foundation for Development of Indigenous Nationalities, which defines Indigenous peoples according to having distinct communities, having their own mother tongues, traditional culture, written and unwritten histories, traditional homeland, geographical areas, plus egalitarian social structures. In the census of Nepal, indigenous peoples make up for about 36% of the total population, but in but in actual, indigenous peoples have claimed that their population is as high as 50%. Right now, 59 and one in the process of being recognized. Communities have been recognized by NIFDIN as indigenous communities, while there are many communities which are still awaiting for recognition at this moment. Likewise, Nepal has ratified various international agreements, which include the ILO 169, the UN DRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the CEDAW, as well as the Paris Agreement. But despite having committed in various international, through these international agreements, indigenous peoples in Nepal continue to face grave issues and concerns, which include the lack of representation in the decision-making spaces, which include the lack of participation in important decisions, as well as often lack of even proper consultation when doing development works, as well as in conservation and various other state introduced projects. Because of this, indigenous peoples, even at the present moment as I'm speaking, are faced with grave violations on their right to their land, right to self-determination, due to development works like the introduction of road projects, introduction of hydropower projects. So this case is a case which exemplifies a case of how indigenous peoples in Nepal are facing these impacts due to not only climate change, which is one of the things that is impacting indigenous peoples very much in Nepal, but also due to development and the education system, which clearly doesn't adequately address our issues and concerns. So here I will be looking at loss and damage, not only through the lens of climate change, but also through the lens of the modern development and education systems of Nepal. So a brief introduction of the community. The study that I'm going to be talking about is based on Udaipur district of Nepal, which lies in the eastern region of Nepal. And the village which I'm going to talk about is Kopche. So Kopche is a village that lies in the hilly region of Udaipur. Udaipur consists of both hilly and plain region, while Kopche lies in the hilly region. So Kopche consists of more than 90% Mogar indigenous people. So Mogar people are indigenous to Kopche. So traditionally in Kopche, Mogar indigenous peoples have been practicing agriculture as well as traditional weaving practices and foraging practices, which they have been practicing since a very long period of time. And when we talk about the main crops that is grown in Kopche, due to the climate and due to the environment and the altitude, maize and millet are the primarily grown crops in Kopche. So first of all, I want to highlight the impacts of climate change which are faced by the communities living here. So because as we talked with the communities there, they shared that compared to previous times, at the present time, there is an unpredictable shift in the time of rainfall. There is increasingly prolonged droughts. And because of this prolonged droughts, there is increasing cases of forest fires, which was never seen around 15 years back. And likewise, there is decreasing wind velocity. There is lesser snow and frost. There are more and more number of flies and mosquitoes and insects and other insects which were not previously seen. And there is lesser production of crops. And not only is there lesser production of crops, even the size of crops is decreasing, due to which if a lesser crops previously would be enough for communities to survive on. Now, this amount of crops and vegetables is not enough for indigenous peoples to survive on. And there is a change in the seasonal calendar, as mentioned before, because of this shifts in the time of rainfall, and there is increasing amount of pests, due to which, in addition to the seasonal change in the seasonal calendar, because of this pests, the number of crops that is produced and that can be consumed by the communities is very less. But while talking about climate change, something else is actually causing more impacts to the communities rather than climate change in this village. So the impacts of development program and projects in Kopche has been another challenge for the communities living here. So when we were talking with one of the elders when we visited Kopche, she shared this remark. All our problems started when rice was introduced to us in the village. So when we heard this remark, we were taken by a bit of surprise. So how had this actually happened was years ago, a road construction project was started in Kopche, and the road construction project was also aimed at addressing the food insecurity by providing sacks of rice to the communities in return of their labor. As so they worked in the construction projects, and they gave their time, gave their effort to it, and in turn of that they were provided with sacks of rice. So traditionally, here indigenous peoples were not familiar with rice. Rice was not part of their diet, but gradually, as rice became easily available rather than other crops, rice slowly started to replace the primary crop, which is maize, in the village, and there was increasing a number of households who were consuming rice as their main food, and which provided them a main diet for the communities living here. But the project didn't last forever. The project eventually ended, and so ended the flow of rice to the communities. And so there is a connotation in Nepal, which is quite popular, that rice is usually eaten by people who are well off and are more developed, which is again a huge part of the education that we have been taught since a very small age, that our own food systems are actually backward, primitive, and we need to adopt something else to become more well off and become more developed. So these connotations started to be developed, and because of this, maize was completely replaced by rice in the community. But now, as rice was no longer readily available to the communities, what happened was the communities were compelled to go to other places, other cities, other countries, in search of income generating opportunities so that they can buy rice from the market. So you can see how a small change, the introduction of rice, was caused such a big impact on the entire food system of indigenous peoples in this community. So traditionally, as I mentioned before, Magar communities had been foraging foods from the forest, but now this practice was completely stopped with the introduction of rice. And because of this practice stopped, the knowledge related to this practice of knowledge related to the forest was no longer continued among younger generations. And because of these impacts, communities are still facing the consequences of the introduction of rice. And now communities are faced with a grave challenge towards their food security because of these developments in the village. So one of the main reasons why this happened is due to the modern education which has been taught to indigenous youths. So this modern education was started in around 1950s in Nepal, and this education was spread all over the country, which promotes one singular type of culture, one singular language, one singular history, which is not always the accurate history, and one single type of food systems, one single type of lifestyle. So as we talked with the communities, one of them shared that before we used to survive by consuming githa byakur, which is foraged foods from the forest, but now our younger generations see it as a matter of shame to consume food and collect it from the forest. So rather than having a food which is still available in the forest, they would rather look for opportunities elsewhere to buy food from the market. So in this way, modern education has led to this idea that our culture, our values, our food systems, our lifestyles is primitive and backward, and youths have been looking elsewhere rather than looking at their own rich culture and practices. And there has been a rejection of their own identities, values, and practices among young generation. There's a detachment from the communities, and there is no sense of belongingness among indigenous youths. Indigenous youths are losing sense of hope in the community, and there is increasing migration. Due to this increasing migration, if you visit this community someday, you will see that there is hardly any youths left in the community, and there is an intergenerational loss of indigenous values, practices, and way of life. Due to this, at the present moment, before going to this, at the present moment, what has happened is indigenous seeds of maize has completely been lost from the communities. These practices have been lost, which is no longer continued in any of the households, because there are no youths, and even the youths there who are there, they are ashamed. They no longer want to continue these practices, and because of this, there has been a huge loss, and which cannot be compared to the the economic losses of properties and losses of houses, which cannot even come close to these losses, are the losses of our culture, our lifestyle, our food systems, and our practices. So despite these challenges, these multiple challenges that indigenous communities here are facing, the communities still have demonstrated a lot of strength to deal with the present crisis. Communities are still the communities who are left, the people who are left in the communities are still providing collective support to each other when they are impacted by disasters like forest fires, which is a very common disaster that happens frequently in Kopche. Additionally, they have also used traditional practices of managing pests, which they are still using to deal with these pests. And additionally, they are also trying to continue the traditional crops and seed preservation techniques to store food, so that the food can last longer, and they are using other varieties of crops that can withstand these climate changes. So they have also initiatives to protect the medicinal herbs which are already available, and they are seeking, as agriculture has not been able to yield enough for their has not been enough for their sustenance. They have been seeking for alternate sources of incomes through handicrafts, through traditional beekeeping practices. So this shows that despite all of these crises, communities are still displaying tremendous strength to continue their practices. But again, this no matter how communities strive to continue, without youths, without the present and the next generations, these practices will not be continued. So, so. To give a background, so I work at the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, which is a research-based organization. CIPRED conducts research, documentation, and publication for the recognition of the roles and contributions of indigenous peoples' knowledge, cultural values, customary governance systems, livelihood practices, which include indigenous food and economic practices. And we have been documenting these cases to shed light to the concerns that development is bringing at the present moment in indigenous lands. Likewise, we believe that without proper proper education and introduction of instilling these values among the young generation, it is not possible to preserve our worldviews, preserve our culture and our practices. So we have been putting every effort for ensuring that the local curriculum in the villages includes indigenous education, and likewise we have also been putting every effort to ensure that youths find hope and youths find inspiration to connect to their youths and remain in their own village rather than going abroad. And we have been providing various trainings, livelihood trainings like homestay trainings, beekeeping trainings, with consultations among community members to make sure that our youth stay in our own village and our practices and our knowledges are continued by the future generations. So in conclusion, while climate change remains a pressing concern for indigenous peoples in Nepal, development works and the present education systems are further aggravating these threats to our knowledge, values, practices, and ways of life. So there needs to be more focus in documenting these cases and bringing shedding light to the concerns of indigenous peoples due to development. There is a need to instill the importance and the value of our way of life among the present and the future generation through locally based education, place-based education from a very young age. A change in the present education system is crucial in bringing transformational change to the present trend. So there needs to be increasing sensitization, and there needs to be a solidarity in indigenous movements to make sure that our issues and concerns are collectively addressed at all spaces. I would like to end my presentation with this. Thank you so much for your time. Tuchichi.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and very much looking forward to discussing as a group. First, we'll give a brief overview of the article, so we've got all the background prepared for our discussion. So the article, the mysterious article in reference, which I will post in the chat right now, is by Dr. Dawa Lokitsang, and it is titled "Are Tibetans Indigenous? The Political Stakes and Potentiality of the Translation of Indigeneity." And it traces a history and present of how, why, and when Tibetans claim or refuse Indigenous identity. One of the major themes of this concise and carefully nuanced piece is how indigeneity is defined, by whom, and how these translations have particular political consequences. She asks, how does settler domination work when those involved in it are neither white nor from the West? How can we critically engage with this while not orientalizing this history as a cultural peculiarity or delinking it from the deep influence of Western empires? And quote, how might North American-centered settler colonialism literature complicate relationships between Asian nation states and their indigenous populations, especially when the latter, for a multitude of reasons, often do not identify as nor are categorized as indigenous, end quote. Which is a very brief overview of a clear and in-depth, but not very long article detailing this history and this information. So is there anything that you would like to add about your piece that was published in August?
Well, I mean, I was basically trying to see how the North American Indigenous Studies scholarship comes to bear when we're looking at land and like a lot of extractive industries are popping up all across Asia. We've been seeing this over the last 20 years, and a lot of the analysis of this has been through the frameworks of capitalism. But there's no discussion of settler colonialism. And I think what's interesting right now in this moment, we're trying to talk about climate and indigenous futures. And we just, on the 6th of
just a few days ago, on the 6th, there was an earthquake that took place that hit central Tibet in Tingri area, Tingri and Shikatse. Tingri is actually in the same region where Solkumpu is, which is on the border of Sherpa country. So it's actually very close to Tibet. So what happens in Tibet is impacting what's going on in Nepal. And we also had the forest fires in California. So we're realizing that, climate futures is not just about indigenous futures, it's about everybody's futures. And so we need to be having a very serious conversation about this because it's not isolating to specific communities. And what's interesting about the earthquake is China is building the world's biggest dams inside Tibet right now. And they're all in seismic areas where earthquakes are prone. So they're trying to, right now, dam up all of the major rivers of Tibet, which flows into downstream countries. Majority of Asian countries rely on these waters. So what happens to Tibetans, it's not an isolated an incident that only impacts Tibetans. It impacts the entire Asian continent about what's going on right now. So we need to be having these conversations in a manner that actually acknowledges how important indigenous activism and sovereignty movements are, and how they're not just about indigenous people, but it's about a future for everybody. And so in many ways, what I wanted to highlight is the connection between indigeneity, settler colonialism, and the importance of sovereignty movements. And that's something that I wanted to pretty much highlight. And that's what I was mostly interested in. And it's also the Idle No More and No Dakota Access Pipeline. Again, these are sovereignty like land rights movements, which is, these are about gas pipelines being dug under sovereign grounds. And again, indigenous people are at the forefront of receiving end of these toxic kinds of developments. And they are the first to have to face it and fight it. And again, the narrative, there wasn't a lot of national coverage of this, obviously, because it unsettles the settler colonial state whenever you cover these sovereignty movements. But these movements essentially was about protecting water and land resources that impact all of us. And that's not how it's talked about. And so I just wanted to emphasize these movements, how powerful they are, and how they impact other people who are also facing the same problem.
Thank you. I think you highlight all of that really powerfully and in a really strong way in the article. And that sets us up beautifully for our questions and our conversation. I'm actually going to jump to the second one because it sort of, I think, connects more directly to what you were just saying. And I pulled a quote on rights-based versus sovereignty models of recognition of indigeneity. Quote, according to Ganawake Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson, rights-based politics seeks recognition from the settler colonial state. Indigenous sovereignty refuses settler state recognition and instead is oriented towards indigenous systems of authority and recognition. In other words, sovereignty becomes the basis through which indigenous communities refuse the settler state, end quote. So I wanted to invite you all to reflect and elaborate on this relationship between Indigenous sovereignty and refusal of the settler state and how this relates to climate change and Indigenous futures and futures for all. Keeping in mind what Emily Ye and Dr. Lokitsang write about how definitions of indigeneity have often been imposed by Western or Chinese environmentalists, as well as another kind of nuanced piece of this conversation. Yeah, the floor is yours. We will throw it to Evan since we haven't heard from you yet.
Thank you and great job, Sharna and Dawa. I think you guys did a great. Oh no. Can you see me? Okay. I don't know what happened there. Okay. Yeah, so I was just thinking about how this is really about it really boils down to how indigenous nations really define their authority in ways that is directly oppositional to colonial and settler frameworks, right? And this is already an issue in the day-to-day, right? When it comes to determining positive things like funding and funding, land rights, all that. Because we see it in Canada all the time. Oh, we're all willing to offer you this funding, but you can provide. And it's an example of how Indigenous nations not to more contra. Sorry, did I freeze?
It's going in and out a little bit.
Okay, I'm gonna turn my video off.
Okay, thank you so much.
If it lets me. Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, sorry. So when we move towards more controversial discussions like those surrounding climate change, this tension like gets stronger and stronger, right? So rights-based approaches really mean that Indigenous communities are negotiating for inclusion, for funding, land protections, but sovereignty-based models means that we're defining our own priorities and it's grounded in our worldviews and our traditional knowledge. And I think we see that in the Wet'suwet'en resistance, because the way they resisted the pipelines exemplified like how they are showing sovereignty over rights. They asserted their hereditary governance systems and they challenged the state. And they said these projects are harming the government and we're not going to support them. And I think it really boils down to when we address climate change, we really have to amplify Indigenous sovereignty and make sure that the solutions we're working towards are respecting Indigenous systems and not just imposing external frameworks that might ultimately end up just commodifying Indigenous lands.
Thank you, Evan. And we'll send it to Sharana.
This conversation strikes to my mind a reality that is happening right now in Nepal. So around like 25 kilometers from where I live, there is an area called Bojeni. And here, Tamang indigenous peoples have been living since generations. And right now, a hydropower project is being introduced in the community here where indigenous peoples have their own ancestral practices that they have been practicing. And with the introduction of this hydropower project, around 500 Tamang indigenous peoples are at the risk of being displaced from their own homeland. So while this issue is getting a lot of attention in various medias, indigenous medias, these issues have not come to light in mainstream medias. And despite all of this, the community, especially the indigenous women, Tamang indigenous women, have been protesting every single day against this. And as Evan also highlighted before, I think that it is very much important that indigenous uh, Indigenous solidarity is very important in this regard for all indigenous communities to come together during these issues, because in the past too, such instances have happened a lot in Nepal, and especially in Kathmandu, Newar indigenous peoples and the whole indigenous communities movement have led to them demanding that no, this is our lands, and you cannot uh, ask us to like to how do I say it? Sorry, you cannot ask us to leave this place, or you cannot evict us in this way. So as he has highlighted, so indigenous solidarity is crucial in amplifying this movement, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Lokitsang, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of talk about the rights versus sovereignty. And I think in many ways, indigenous movements have to be really strategic between the two. I mean, historically, that's the maneuvering that they've done in order to protect their communities and whatever left resources. But what I think is interesting about this rights versus sovereignty dynamic is how in many ways the colonization of Tibet is really impacting the rest of Asia. I know that like, you know, Sarana just talked about these evictions. The same evictions were imposed on Tibetans with all of these planned mega dams. And last year, communities were told to that they were going to be evicted from their ancestral villages. These are centuries old villages, and they have centuries old Tibetan Buddhist monasteries in them. And you know, entire communities in the Dege region of Tibet, which is Eastern Tibet, were told that they had to be, they were going to be evicted. And, you know, Tibetans there tried to protest their eviction, trying to access their rights. China says that Tibetans have rights as Chinese citizens. And immediately there was massive arrests. Within like 1 day of protesting, they arrested over 1,000 people. So Tibetans don't even have a voice about like even being able to kind of report of these kinds of unlawful evictions. They're actually like violating constitutional rights that China says that Tibetans have as its citizens, and which is very similar to what is going on in North America. So I think in these sense, it's really useful for these communities who are being hydropower right now is becoming a major issue in like Tibet right now, and it is going to completely impact these downstream countries. But what I've noticed is I've gone to different conversations about these impacts in like parts of India, Vietnam, whether it's the Mekong or the Yangtze, or a lot of these rivers come from Tibet, and they're fed by the mountain regions of Tibet. And none of them it feels like there are these separate conversations happening, and everybody's complaining about the same dam, but there's no like recognition that we're all fighting the same system and same colonial states. So I think in many ways, you know, indigenous solidarity needs to be replicated in a sense where we're actually paying attention to each other's like situation and trying to find ways to kind of organize together in a manner that could be powerful for all of us.
Well, thank you all so much for your responses. Keeping an eye on the time and aiming for a Q&A, I'm going to jump to the third question as it also connects to what we're talking about in Indigenous solidarity. So the quote that we will be sort of discussing, quote, "Another reason Indigenous movements and scholars have not completely thrown out the terminology of indigeneity is due to its salience in generating global solidarities between Native peoples and their anti-colonial stance against settler state encroachment. Judging from its evolutionary trajectory, indigeneity has gone from being a colonial construct to a terminology operationalized by global indigenous movements to advance solidarities and sovereignty claims against settler nations and capitalist institutions in cahoots," end quote. So given that that two of you have recently been to COP 28 and 29, and Dr. Lokitsang organizing this panel in 2017, having these conversations on these grand and sort of global scales, I'm curious to hear about your experiences in these spaces and your experience of how these spaces have or have not been conducive of global Indigenous solidarities in your experience. Let's go with the same order again, just to keep the flow. So, Evan.
I'm going to turn off my video first. Oh, can you go with the next person and I'll go next?
Yes, we'll send it to Sharana, please. Thank you.
I was just jotting down my points, but okay. So I recently attended the COP29. So it was actually my first time attending the COP climate conference. So it was a relatively new experience for me. So, but uh, ahead of the COP, I was also, sorry, please. Okay. Ahead of the COP also, I had the opportunity to also attend these pre-sessional sessions on the Indigenous Peoples platform that happened prior to the COP, and I was also lucky enough to attend these discussions and meetings. So what is my opinion based on my participation is that although within Indigenous peoples, I could see a strong sense of solidarity and strong sense of ownership regarding our issues and regarding the impacts of climate change and different issues were coming together. But during the time of the negotiations, these were not reflected. And Indigenous, as I sat across these negotiation in the issues that we were so passionately discussing on were rarely making it to these negotiation spaces. And as elders had highlighted previously too, there is a need to have Indigenous representatives at the table uh, in in an equal level within negotiating across these spaces, so which couldn't be seen there. So it was just, even within these pavilions we had of Indigenous peoples, it was just Indigenous peoples presenting and Indigenous peoples were listening, but there were no representatives from other party representatives, other representatives. There were no there were this lack of other representatives who are listening to our actually listening to our issues and actually trying to hear our voices. So that is what I found a lot lacking. And likewise, being a representative, especially an Indigenous youth from Asia, I could see that there was a very much lack. Even within these Indigenous spaces, there was a lack of representation of Asian youths, Indigenous youths, and issues that especially concern Indigenous peoples across Asia. So that's what I found, that although within our own spaces we were raising our voices, we were passionately raising our voices for our concerns, this was not reflected in the negotiations where it actually matters the most. And as you know, the outcomes of the COP29 have been greatly disappointing for Indigenous peoples, and a lot of it has also been because there is no representation. There is a lack of representation of our voices in the actual negotiation spaces. Thank you. And now on to Evan, I think.
I think I fixed it. No. Okay. I'm going to speak anyway. So when I went to COP, I think a big thing that stood out for me is that as Sharna was saying, yeah, I felt like a lot of the Indigenous representation was like separate from other representation. So Indigenous events were separate. We weren't fulsomely included in every aspect of the process. We were there to be there. And I found even small things were made a huge difference. So the host country was not and this happened again this year. The host country was not a safe space for LGBTQ plus people. And we know that in Canadian Indigenous culture, I'm not sure, I think other ones as well, but I'm going to speak to what I know, that two-spirit is extremely important, right? And a lot of Indigenous peoples in Canada see there's a middle place between a man and a woman. So I have a friend who couldn't attend because they identify in that middle space, and they could have been persecuted for using the women's washroom, because there's laws against that. A woman dressed as a man using the washroom, man dressed as a woman. There was also a situation where we went to an event and an Indigenous youth felt extremely stressed out and upset by it. And afterwards, she went outside to the smoking area and smudged. And she was asked to stop. Another youth was asked to stop drumming. And things like that show that they were told that their drumming was political, and that in order to drum, they must get permission 24 hours in advance. So things like this show that a lot of the inclusion of Indigenous peoples at United Nations events are unfortunately performative, right? They'd like us to sit in the back in our regalia for the photos, but once we get the drum out, we're being disruptive. Once we go to the smoking area to smudge, which is already going out of our way to meet their requirements, we're being disruptive, right? So that was my big notice in COP, is that I found that I was hurt by the way they included us, and I felt like I wouldn't see much long-term change if they continue to do it that way, because I can't think of that many people that could go yearly to an event like that and not burn out trying to protect their rights after a while. So that was my experience in COP. And I'm really thankful I got to go. And I'm really thankful that there was such a strong Indigenous caucus there that was supporting each other and getting each other through this. But I'd also like to see equal support from the United Nations.
Thank you, Evan. And we'll pass it to Dr. Lokitsang.
Well, thank you guys. You guys basically confirmed a lot of my skepticism about COP anyways, and these international spaces of dialogue and diplomacy where they claim to be putting climate on the agenda. But I just want to first say that the climate issue is a political issue. I think that we must, if we need to understand that anti-colonial and anti-imperial movements are themselves about the climate too. And because there's this tendency in the environmental movement to kind of greenwash these elements of where climate change originated, I mean, as a force that's impacting all of the earth, is actually a force that was, promoted through an imperial project. And in many ways, those projects are being copied in Asia as we speak right now. I think it's fascinating that North America has come to realize that hydropower dams were actually not good. They're actually destroying ecologies and communities. I mean, historically, it was used as a way to remove entire indigenous communities off their lands. And in the long run, they've actually been proven to be antithetical to anything environmentally friendly. And now we have these, exact same infrastructures being replicated in Asia. So this repetition of colonial projects and the way that they transform environmental geographies, and how in many ways these are repetitions of these structures that have already been proven to be like dangerous here. But in terms of talking about solidarity, I recently attended and presented at a Global Indigenous Studies conference in Indiana, at the Indiana University in Bloomington. And what I realized there was it was a conference full of Indigenous people from around the world. And I think, first of all, we need to have spaces where Indigenous people are coming together to understand what's going on in our specific regions. Because like I said, these problems keep being highlighted as individual specific problems in specific regions, in many ways, they're all connected, especially when it's the same imperial projects and same imperial states that are doing the same kinds of projects and same companies. But what I learned there was that in many ways, indigenous communities are the first to have to be impacted by the loss and damages of climate change. And at the same time, they're battling the systemic erasure of their languages and cultures by settler states. And what we're learning from environmental scientists now is that in many ways, indigenous approach to the environment and the world in many ways is the answer for repairing a lot of this damages that has already been done through capitalist extractive kinds of industries, right? So on the one hand, indigenous people are also being looked at as the very solution for climate change. But then at the same time, they're actually on the receiving end of a lot of this like damage, but also are battling the systemic erasure. And many in North America, a lot of communities are engaged in revitalizing their languages to redevelop these lost connections to languages and lands and places and concepts of how we, form relationships with each other and the earth. And, at the same time, I know that, for example, like China in many ways has not only copied colonial infrastructures like hydro colonization, right? But at the same time, China has recently launched the intensive boarding school programs that Canada is only recently acknowledging with that history and the damage and the many generations that it has like impacted. But China is so in many ways, as much as China is looking to Canada and North America for like capitalist infrastructure developments in their newly forming colonies, but at the same time they're also copying the exact same ways in which they removed indigenous people off their original land and tried to erase their like knowledge systems. The same knowledge systems that scientists are now realizing are in many ways is key to to restoring our ecology. So, being able to be at these spaces where we're able to have conversations together and have these understandings together, and in many ways from a place of empathy and care, becomes grounds for ways of imagining, political advocacy. In many ways, I feel like right now, in many, like COP, for example, I think it is like, in some ways, from what I've heard, it does become a space for a lot of indigenous communities fighting climate justice issues to get to know each other and form alliances and networks with each other. But in many ways, that space is also it puts us in a situation where we're asking these like hierarchical institutions to like listen to us. And in many ways, they don't listen to us. But that's why I find, for me, Idle No More and the North Dakota Access Pipeline was extremely powerful because not only were they challenging the United States government and the Canadian government using their own sovereign histories about their land, but these movements became a space for other indigenous communities around the world to see, like, not only like the same kinds of problems being reflected and talked about, but also to see powerful movements. I know that North Dakota Access Pipeline camp area became a ground for indigenous solidarity, and all of these different groups came there to express the same issues. So I think there needs to be a way where, in the article I say, how do we form solidarity and movement with each other that doesn't necessarily have to rely on settler states or these capitalist institutions. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of these kinds of spaces being made, but I will say that the Global Indigenous Studies Conference became a ground for that. And first, we need to be able to understand each other to be able to form community and movement with each other. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I believe Evan wanted to respond really quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build off of what Dr. Lokitsang said. Just because You mentioned something about how like we had learned from these dams, and it immediately brought something to my mind because I actually, until this event, didn't. And you're talking about the importance of us organizing on a global scale, and I, until this event, didn't know that we were facing the same problem, and I guess you didn't either, because I'm going to read you an article headline from BC that came out November 21st. The Site C BC Hydro Dam to be given an Indigenous name after it flooded Treaty 8 territory. So this is actually an issue that, like, I guess it's a global issue, right? Because at the same time, as Dr. Lokitsang said, Indigenous peoples highlight the importance of addressing climate change, and colonial governments say we have a solution for that. We're going to build a dam on your land, and it's an issue, I guess, across the world. So yeah, I think this is a big call to action for me about the importance of working more organizing on a global scale, because I think we're all really facing the same issues.
Thank you so much for your response and for all of you sharing. Thank you so much for being here. We've reached the end of our time. So we will close things out here. I'm going to post some further calls to action from everybody or links and networks so that you can stay connected, and those are in the chat now. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here at all kinds of times of the day from where you are, and thank you for all of the work that you do and sharing your voices with us. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. Thank you to the David Lamb Center for sponsoring and hosting the event. Thank you to SFU IT team, Omar and Amanda, for all of your support. Wishing you all a fabulous rest of your day, wherever you are, a peaceful new year, and land back.